Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. This time we are going to be doing the version 2.0 of my Ego Gift tier list. Now you might be wondering what happened to version 1.0 because it's currently unlisted on my channel, and put simply, it was bad. It was not a very good list. My rankings were pretty inconsistent and just honestly not well thought out, mostly because I went into it doing zero preparation whatsoever. But this time around, I have actually done preparation. I've got a bunch of notes here ready to go, and well, put simply, I actually understand how I'm ranking them this time around, which should make it much, much better and more accurate. Anyways, first things first, I suppose I should fill you in on exactly how I will be ranking these ego gifts. And put simply, it's entirely determined on how likely you are to actually pick them up when you do see them in a run. So things like the actual rarity of the ego gift I'm going to be completely ignoring entirely, as well as I will only exclusively be looking at the max upgraded versions of every ego gift. So, first off, in the top tier is the Instapick category. This is essentially ego gifts that you will take every single time whenever they show up. They are just that good and will always provide benefit no matter what team composition you're running. After that, we have the Instapick specific category, which is the same thing, but it is entirely determined based off of what specific team composition you're running. So if you get a burn ego gift, that would fall under this category, but you're running a Rupture team, then you would never actually pick that up. Unlike with the tier above, where if you get one of those, even if you are running a Rupture or burn team, you would pick that up. Below that is the generally good tier, which is basically you would prioritize this one less than the other two, but they would still provide benefit no matter what team composition you're running. And the tier after that is good specific, which, just like the Instapick version, is team specific. So burn teams would take the burn egos, and they would only take the burn egos, and basically stuff like that. After that, we have the mid tier, which is just very mid gifts. Ones that do something, but it's like, it doesn't really matter what they do. Like, it's a nice benefit, but you don't really care about the benefit that much. And after that, the last tier is just the bad tier, which they're just bad ego gifts because they will just basically never give you any value, or give you so little value that they're basically just sell fodder, essentially. Now that that's been established, we can actually start beginning our rankings. And first on the list, we have the Hellterfly's Dream. When applying burn to an enemy with burn potency, randomly inflict a total of 5 burn between all enemies. When activating Wrath Resonance, randomly inflict a total of 8 burn potency between all enemies at combat start. Now, this ego gift is very good for stacking high burn potency really quickly onto multiple targets. And that also includes abnormalities with multiple parts, which can make it so that it's actually very easy to not only stack up a single burn stack, but actually multiple burn stacks. So you get multiple procs of very high burn potency every single turn, which is pretty much what this gift excels at. And because of that, because it generally makes it so that your burn application is basically doubled, I would say that it's an insta-pick for burn teams. Just because of the abnormalities with multiple parts. Up next on the list, we have Perversion. After defeating one or more enemy using an attack skill, gain +1 ego resource of that attack skill's affinity at the next turn start. If the attack skill's affinity was Wrath, gain +1 ego resource of all affinities the ally has at the next turn start instead. So this ego gift essentially doubles your ego generation of used skills, which can be good if you have enough skills to actually be able to fuel all of your egos, but it only really excels when you actually have a Wrath identity, and even better if you have multiple Wrath identities. So it's kind of only really good if you do have Wrath on your team, and if you don't, then it's kind of okay, but not very good. So I'd say it's good specific, just simply because of the Wrath. Up next, we have Ashes to Ashes. Combat start, inflict 3 burn potency on all enemies or Abno parts. So 3 burn potency is not very much at all. It only does it once the entire time, and it's very, very incredibly minimal and basically pointless. The only really good use of this ego gift is to fuse it into the fusible ego gift for burn. But other than that, it's basically pointless. So I would put it in the bad tier. But because it is a requirement for the fusible gift, I'd say it would go mid, just for that alone. Next up, we have the Phlebotomy Pack. When hitting an enemy with a skill, heal 12.5% of the character's missing HP, once per character per turn. If the skill's affinity was Wrath, heal 25% of missing HP instead. This is a very, very consistent healing ego gift. It will pretty much always give you value, no matter what. And it just gets better the more damaged you actually are. So you're always going to get value out of this. I'd say it's always somewhat worth considering in pretty much every team. Most healing gifts are. I mean, healing is super, super good, so it's never something you'd want to say no to. Unless it's like 1 healing every turn or something crazy like that. Next up, we have the Wound Cleric. Clerid, sorry, I keep calling this thing Cleric for some reason. I don't know why, but I do. When hitting an enemy with a skill that inflicts bleed potency, or with a Wrath affinity skill, inflict 5 bleed potency and 1 bleed count. This little guy right here is absolutely insane at stacking up bleed. By itself, with like only 2 bleed identities, I'd say, you can very, very easily stack up a max burn stack, bleed stack. And with the +1 bleed count application, it also makes it so that it's very difficult to actually lose that stack too. So definitely an insta-pick for bleed teams, without a doubt. Next up, we have Coffee and Cranes. Turn start, gain +1 ego resource of a random affinity that does not correspond to any attack skill used last turn. If a Lust affinity skill is used last turn, gain 1 of every affinity ego resource that does not correspond to any attack skill affinity used last turn instead. This is, without a doubt, one of the single best ego resource generators in the game, but only if you have less skills. Otherwise, it's pretty bad. It's definitely better than Perversion, though, because Perversion only gives you ego affinities that you actually have, whereas Coffee and Crane can actually give you ones you don't have. So if you're soloing, for example, and you're missing a very specific ego resource for one of your egos, just taking this will be able to provide that for you. But it is an insta-pick if you do have a less skill on your team. Even if it's just one, like a skill 3 or something, it's still worth it. Next up, we have the Eclipse of Scarlet Moths. Turns start when dealing damage with an attack skill for the first time. Deal half its damage as fixed damage to a random enemy. If the attack skill's affinity was Lust, deal said damage to 2 random enemies instead. This guy is absolutely amazing at passive damage. It's so good that it can even like stagger enemies for you that normally wouldn't have been staggered anyways, and then that's just free extra damage the next turn. Plus you don't need to clash with them, so if you're on a high floor, the stagger just completely ignores their skills, and you don't need to clash with their stupid high rolls. So that alone brings it up like really high for me, and I would say that it's an instant pick every time, especially if you do have a Lust skill, just like Coffee and Cranes. It doubles the amount of value you get out of it, which is absolutely crazy. Up next, we have the Grimy Iron Stake. When hitting an enemy using a single coin skill, inflict 1 bleed potency and 2 defense level down until the end of the next turn. If the target already has bleed, inflict 3 bleed potency instead. So the good thing about this is you can always get value out of it, no matter what team you're using, because by nature of it working with single coin skills means that it works with every ego in the game. But unfortunately, the actual benefit that you get from it is pretty pathetic. 2 defense level down and a single bleed, that's like absolutely nothing. So yeah, I'd have to put it in bad, just because it doesn't really do anything, and there's no way to make it better or anything. It's not one of the ones that can get upgraded, unfortunately. Because if it could get the defense level, the value, the number of that, if that could go up, then it would be better, because 3 defense level down is equivalent to 1 fragile, so that's 10% extra damage. But because of how little it is, it's only 2, so it's like, what, 6% I think? At 2, which is basically nothing. It's just not worth it, to be honest. Next we have Fiery Down. When hitting an enemy with a skill that inflicts burn potency, or a Lust affinity skill, inflict 4 burn potency. Turn start, if the enemy has 20 burn potency, multiply it by 2.5. This basically means that once you have 20 burn potency on an enemy, it will double it, making it so that it literally just straight up halves the amount of turns needed to get a max burn stack, basically. Which is absolutely crazy good at how much value that gives. Basically doubling the amount of damage you have, like, super early. I mean, technically it is pretty easy to get a max burn stack already, but this thing just has it happen a few turns earlier, basically. And with new Darefray Shoots Otis coming out, with her Dark Flame status effect, it's like getting a max stack a turn earlier is very, very important. So it's definitely insta-pick and burn teams, without a doubt. Next up, we have Bloody Gadget. Now this little guy is one of the guys that I got horribly wrong in the 1.0 version of the tier list. And the reason why I ranked it so badly is because I had it, put simply, I had a solo bias. And I ranked it much higher than it should have been because it's really good when soloing. But in actual team comps, it's not that good. Turn start, it applies 2 damage up to 2 random allies, and if those allies had a lust skill, then it adds an extra 2. So you can already see why it's super good soloing. Like just having a permanent 20 to 40% damage boost is really good. But when you're not soloing, it only affects 2 allies, which isn't that good, especially with the other damage boosting ego gifts, which most of them affect the entire team. So I'd have to rank this mid. Next we have the Sunshower. When activating Sloth Absolute Resonance or using a skill with 2+ attack weight, all allies gain +2 skill power at combat start. +2 skill power is very impactful, especially in Mirror Dungeon, where the difference between a 1 clash and a lost one can be as small as a single point difference. So by having that extra 2 skill power, it's very impactful, and sometimes can be the difference between actually winning a fight or not. And also, pretty much every single sinner in the game has an AoE ego, so pretty much everybody can activate this, no problem. Of course, it's not actually, like, something you want all the time, because it is just 2 skill power at the end of the day. That's more damage, better clashing, stuff like that. But you do have to use an ego to get value out of it most of the time, which sometimes, you know, you don't want to. The sanity cost could be too much or something like that, and it's good, but not something you take every time, you know? Next up, we have Today's Expression. After defeating an enemy by using a Sloth Affinity or Blunt Damage skill, raise the unit's Blunt skill power by 2 until the end of next turn. Any effect that happens on enemy defeating is, simply put, not very good for most bosses. There are a few that do have minions, like My Form Empties or the Drifting Fox. They do have minions that you can end up killing, and you can get value out of this, but more often than not, you're going to end up not getting value from this. Also, you need to actually make sure that the guy who's, you know, defeating the enemy actually has blunt skills, so that just makes it even more situational. So basically, it's not good. Very unreliable, and even when it can be used, you might get a boss that just straight up doesn't have any minions, so you can't do anything with it. Next, we have the Talisman Bundle. Whenever an ally deals 1 HP damage to an enemy with a skill, inflict 3 Rupture potency on target. If they used a Slash skill, inflict 5 potency and 1 count instead. This is a very good bonus damage, even if you aren't using a Rupture team. But it becomes even better if you are using a Rupture team. Simply because most of the 7 Association have Slash skills. Meaning, if you've got this and 7 Association, a lot of their attacks will always be inflicting +1 Rupture count. So definitely insta-pick specific. You want this in a Rupture team. You can take it in regular teams too. Free Rupture damage is free Rupture damage, so there's no reason not to take it in every team, but it does excel the most in actual Rupture teams. Next, we have the Rusty Commemorative coin. If the first single coin attack skill that an ally uses during the combat phase doesn't defeat any enemies, use the skill one more time. After defeating an enemy by using a sloth or single coin skill, the ally gains +1 skill power for the next turn. So the +1 skill power portion of this ego gift is basically irrelevant. It's a nice bonus, but you realistically don't care about that in the slightest. The reason you're actually using this and picking it up is because you want to be able to duplicate your egos, which is very good for a ton of damage, but it does have the negative drawback of instantly depleting all of your sanity. So it is very good, but you do need to be very careful when actually using it. Otherwise, it could be the run killer that you have. It could absolutely just destroy your run on its own. But it's still very good. It's definitely a thing you need to think about before you actually pick it up, because it basically completely changes how you actually play the game. Next, we have Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Skills deal 15% damage to staggered enemies, and if the skill was Sloth, deal 30% damage instead. Very straightforward. Bonus damage to staggered enemies. Nothing that bad, nothing particularly good either. I mean, damage is good, but you know, it's fine. It's fine the way it is. You can take it in any team and get value from it. It's fine. Next, we have the Green Spirit. After hitting a non-staggered enemy by using a Gluttony affinity skill, or inflicting Tremor potency using skill effects, randomly inflict a total of 8 Tremor potency between all enemies or Avno parts. This is very similar to the Hellterfly's Dream, but instead of burn, it's for Tremor, which makes it very good for building up Tremor before you actually stagger the enemy. But it does make it inconsistent if there's multiple targets or Avno parts. One of the biggest issues with Tremor is typically you end up doing too much damage initially, and before you can actually build up a decent sized Tremor stack, you've already staggered the enemy, and then the Tremor is completely useless. So this does help so that you can actually get value out of Tremor before you accidentally stagger the enemy by pure damage alone. And because of that, it is okay. It's not bad. Next, we have the Lithograph. Whenever an enemy is staggered, the ally with the least HP heals 5% of their max HP. If they have a Gluttony skill, heal 10% instead. This is definitely one of the more consistent healing gifts, especially when considering regular fights. In regular fights, there's around 6 enemies, so you're pretty much always healing around 30% health of all of your sinners, so you're pretty much always going to get value out of this no matter what, if you are taking damage. And because of that, it's very good, very consistent, and one of the better healing gifts. Up next, we have the Crown of Roses. Turn start, inflict 4 Rupture potency on 3 random enemies. When activating Gluttony Absolute Resonance, inflict 4 Rupture potency on all enemies at combat start. This is straight up bad. It is not good in the slightest. It's doing the same thing Ashes to Ashes is, but for Rupture. And honestly, it's worse for Rupture. Because since it's only potency, that basically means that the second you start attacking the enemy that it got inflicted on, the Rupture stack is gone in an instantly. So it's basically just a free 4 to 12 damage on the first turn, and that's it. If you have Gluttony, it is more, but it's barely anything, so very bad. Not good at all, even in Rupture teams. Next on the list, we've got Sticky Muck. When hitting an enemy with a Pierce skill or a Gluttony affinity skill, inflict 2 defense level down. So, like I said before with the Grimy Iron Stake, defense level down, it's about 3 of them is equivalent to 1 fragile. So, having this on the team, if you've got any identity with around 3 Pierce coins on a single skill, that's essentially the equivalent of 2 fragile just by using that single skill, which is very, very, very good. But of course, it does have the requirement of needing Pierce or Gluttony. It is very good. Basically free fragile if you have those, but you do need them. Next up, we have the White Gossypium. Turn start, if there are staggered enemies, unstagger them. Then inflict 12 plus stagger level times 6 bleed potency, and 12 plus stagger level times 6 offense level and defense level down on them. Activates once per enemy per encounter. So typically speaking, the stagger level will always be 1. And that basically means that you're going to be inflicting around 18 bleed potency and 18 offense level and defense level down, which is a very significant amount, mind you. The downside of unstaggering the enemy is, typically speaking, very bad. It's just such a drastic loss in damage that typically it's not worth it in the slightest. However, when you're actually using this in a bleed team, it is probably one of the best ego gifts you can actually have, because the only thing that really stops bleed damage is if the enemy is staggered. Because if the enemy is staggered, that means they're not using any attacks that have coins, and if they're not using any coins, that means that the bleed cannot tick down. So basically, what this does is, when you have it in a bleed team, it essentially gets rid of the only negative drawback of bleed damage, which is the enemy not attacking. But because it's absolutely terrible everywhere else, I would have to say it's good specific. You just, pretty much everything above generally good, I would say you can pretty much take in any team composition whatsoever and it will do something, but not for this one. Not for this one. Next up, we have the Blue Zippo Lighter. Turn start, gain +1 Gloom Ego Resource and +1 Ego Resource of 2 other random affinities. Without a doubt, the single best Ego Resource generator in the entire game. No contest. You take this thing in any team, anytime, and you will be able to use your egos whenever the hell you feel like. Sure, you might need to stall a few turns here or there, but like, that's not really a big deal. Next up, we have the Phantom Pain. Skills with 1 attack weight deal 15% extra damage. When activating Gloom Absolute Resonance, apply 2 offense level up to all allies at combat start. This is one of the ego gifts that I was talking about when I was referring to Bloody Gadget. It's better than Bloody Gadget, simply because it affects the entire team. And pretty much every single regular skill has 1 attack weight. There are a couple exceptions. She Heathcliff and Regret Faust, for example. But generally speaking, the only AoE attacks are egos. So it doesn't work with egos, and that's basically it, but it's good. Free damage is good. Pretty much always. Next up, we have the Thunderbranch. When inflicting Rupture potency with skill effects, inflict 3 Rupture potency and +1 Rupture count on target. If the skill's affinity was Gloom, inflict 3 Rupture potency and +2 Rupture count instead. This is pretty much just as good as the Talisman Bundle. They do basically the same thing, except this one is much more consistent with its count application, as it gives it whenever you actually apply Rupture. Whereas Talisman, it requires slash skills to give Rupture count. So it is better than Talisman because it's more consistent at doing what it does. But they're basically the same thing, to be honest. Hi, editing Q here. So yeah, I am completely wrong about them being basically identical. You see, I was under the impression that Talisman Bundled worked off of every single damage tick, meaning that it applied the Rupture and Rupture count after every single coin roll, but no, it doesn't work like that. It instead only applies the Rupture and the Rupture count after the skill has fully concluded, which, as a result, means that for every single attack you only get the Rupture and 1 count. So it's definitely significantly worse than I thought it was, and Thunderbranch far outperforms it. There is a little bit in the future where, you know, I keep comparing other things to Talisman Bundle, but just keep in mind that, typically speaking, they're wrong. I might come back and correct myself, basically. So yeah, let's keep going with the video. Next, we have the Melted Eyeball. Inflict 5 offense level down and 5 defense level down next turn against enemies affected by Tremor Burst. This is one of the better Tremor gifts, simply because it gives value to Tremor Bursting when the enemy no longer has a stagger bar. One of the biggest issues with Tremor is, like I said, if the enemy can no longer be staggered, Tremor is completely useless. This is one of the things that makes it so that it's not completely useless and actually does something. It may not be very much. It is too fragile at the end of the day, or almost too fragile, I should say, but it does give benefit to Tremor, so that makes it an insta-pick. Next, we have the Grey Coat. When using this skill with 2+ attack weight, increase its damage by 20%. When hitting an enemy with a skill with 2+ attack weight, or a Gloom affinity skill, heal by 20% of the damage dealt. This guy right here is, much like the blue Zippo lighter, the single best healing ego gift in the entire game. Every single sinner in the game can take advantage of it because every single sinner in the game has an AoE ego. So they're always getting a 20% damage boost to those egos, and they're always healing 20% of the damage that they did with those egos. If you have this and somebody is on death's door, all you need to do is pop an ego with them, and they're instantly back at pretty much full health. Next, we have the Late Bloomer's Tattoo. When hitting an enemy with a single coin skill or a Pride Affinity skill, gain 2 offense level up and 2 defense level up next turn. This guy is not very good. In regards to the single coin skill aspect of it, it's very bad unless you're using ego, but the ego has to be AoE. And more often than not, it's like it needs to be a minimum of 5 attack weight to get the maximum value out of it, which not every single sinner can do. So it's not that good of value, and you pretty much need either a pride skill with lots of coins or a 5 attack weight ego skill to get any real value out of this. So yeah, pretty bad. Not unusable though. You can still get value out of it, but not particularly good either. Next up, we have the Lowest Star. When hitting an enemy with a blunt skill or a Pride Affinity skill, inflict 5 fixed SP damage on target. Allies with less than 0 SP deal 25% more damage. This thing is completely useless in boss fights. Most of them do not have any sanity, and the ones that do are like floor 1, so the only thing it actually does is give extra damage to Enclair or Suncliff, so it's incredibly niche and pretty much useless 99% of the time. Next, we have Prejudice. First turn start of an encounter, the ally with the least HP heals 15% of their max HP. When activating Pride Absolute Resonance, the ally with the least HP heals 12.5% of their missing HP at combat start. Again, healing is never a bad thing. Always something you can rely on. And this one is even better if you have Pride skills, but even just a 12% heal at the very start of an encounter, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. You can get value out of it always. Next is the Little and To Be Naughty Plushie. Deal 10% damage against enemies with bleed, and take minus 20% damage from enemies with bleed. If you have Pride, it becomes 20% bonus damage and minus 30% damage taken instead. This is obviously only good with bleed teams, but the values it does have are good. They are very good values. Having a straight up minus 20% damage taken is really, really good. And the bonus damage is also nice. Next is the Gathering Skulls. After defeating an enemy by using a Pride Affinity or Pierce Damage skill, raise the unit's Pierce power by 2 for the next 2 turns. This thing is basically identical to today's expression, but it's for Pierce damage instead of blunt. Yay! Just as useless. Next we have Nixie Divergence. The first turn start of a wave, inflict 5 Tremor potency and 5 Tremor count to all enemies. When hitting an enemy with an Envy skill, inflict 3 Tremor potency on the target. This is not particularly good for Tremor teams. Like I said, honestly the thing you want with Tremor teams is potency, because you want to be able to stack the potency up very quickly before you actually stagger the enemy through sheer damage alone. It does inflict a decent amount of Tremor count, so you can burst Tremor a lot. So that's at least good. But the fact that it basically only works once, and then with Envy skills, it's honestly pretty mid. Not the greatest thing in the world. Next is the Dreaming Electric Sheep. After defeating an enemy by using an Envy Affinity or Slash Damage skill, raise the unit's slash skill power by 2 for the next 2 turns. When activating Envy Absolute Resonance, all allies gain 2 offense level up and 2 defense level up at combat start. This guy is, again, the same as these two, but at least it does give some benefit outside of the defeating an enemy. So whenever a boss doesn't have minions, you can still technically get value out of this. You just need to have 3 NV skills in a row, which is not something that happens often. Next is the Standard Duty Battery. When hitting an enemy with a skill, inflict 3 Rupture potency on target. If the skill's affinity was Envy, inflict 5 Rupture potency on target instead. This guy is basically the exact same as the Talisman Bundle. The only difference is it works on Envy instead of Slash, and does not inflict Rupture count. So, I would say that the Talisman Bundle is better than it, just because of the Rupture count. But other than that, they're basically equivalent. Hi, Editing Q here again. So, yeah, Standard Duty Battery is without a doubt better than Talisman, because it works on every single coin hit instead of just once per skill, which is kind of weird because of how both of them are worded. Each of them say when hit by a skill, so it's kind of a little bit strange how differently they both function from one another. Anyways, yeah, back to the video. Next is the Pinpoint Logic Circuit. When hitting an enemy with an NV affinity skill or a skill that inflicts burn potency, inflict additional burn potency by half the skill's total coins, rounded up. This guy is good, but it entirely depends on how many coins you have. Most skills only have 3, which means it will be inflicting around 2 burn potency every hit, which is decent, because that would be a total of 6 burn potency for every skill, which isn't bad by any means. It's pretty good. So I would say it's good specific. Good for burn teams. Decent if you're in just a regular team with envy skills, but not the craziest thing in the world. Next we have the Voodoo Doll. Turn start, deal 5 fixed envy affinity damage to all enemies. Inflict 2 attack power down to enemies with 50% or less HP. This guy's pretty good, not gonna lie. Having just a permanent -2 attack power on all enemies for half the fight is very good. Like I said, pretty much the difference between a 1 clash and a lost clash most of the time is around 1 to 2 power. So being able to reduce that by that much permanently is very, very beneficial. Next is the Carmilla. At the start of a non-focus encounter, all enemies take fixed damage equal to 30% of their max HP. This guy is very good, especially when it comes to the fact that in the mirror dungeon, the enemies are constantly gaining lots and lots of HP. Being able to just cut that by 30% at the start of a fight, it makes it much easier to be able to stagger them turn 1. And I'm not 100% sure if it can do this, but if their stagger bar is low enough, it might be able to stagger them. Maybe. Which would definitely make it much better. I'm sure if Scarlet Moths can stagger enemies, Carmilla should be able to stagger them too. Next, we have the Child Within a Flask. Encounters start, gain +1 ego resource for every sin affinity. It's fine. It gives you an extra sin resource at this once every fight. It's not that good, to be honest. Like, having it only happen once a fight, whereas like every single other one happens like at least 6, maybe even 10 times. It's not that good. It's probably the worst ego generator in the game, I'd say. Next we have the Illusory Hunt. Focused encounter start, apply 2 damage up to all allies. I'm pretty sure how this works is it's basically just a 20% damage bonus for the first turn of every boss. I could be wrong about it activating only for the first turn, but I'm pretty sure it only happens for the first turn. And because of that, it's not very good. If it was just like a permanent 20% damage bonus, then it would be pretty good, but only for the first turn? Who really cares, really, about the first turn? You're generally not going to be having all of your big damage skills that turn, so you're not really going to get a whole lot of value out of it. Next is Homeward. Encounter start, all participating allies heal 12% of their max HP. This is just easy, free healing. You pick this up and you never have to worry about healing pretty much ever again in your entire life. It does the same thing as Prejudice basically, but it applies to every ally. So it's good. It's very good. Up next is Tomorrow's Fortune. Increase the number of options by 1 when choosing an ego gift to get. This is without a doubt one of the single best ego gifts in the game. Being able to just have an extra choice means that you're much more likely to actually be able to find the specific ego gift that will basically make you unstoppable. And that is probably the single most powerful effect you can have in a game like this. Alright, next up is the Red Order. Whenever an ally inflicts sinking potency on enemies with skill effects, the ally gains 2 offense level next turn, max of 4. Allies with Wrath skills, upon inflicting sinking potency on enemies with skill effects, gain 3 offense level instead, max of 6. This is not particularly useful. I mean, having 6 offense level is decent. 2 clash power is not that bad, but if you don't have a Wrath skill and sinking, then it doesn't really benefit you very much. I'd say it's probably down here, somewhere with the Late Bloomer's tattoo in terms of strength. They both kind of do the same thing, sort of. Next we have Smokes and Wires. Allies inflict 2.5 times bleed potency with skill effects. Turn end, enemies with bleed lose 3 speed next turn. Being able to double your bleed application is absolutely crazy good. And the speed debuff basically means that you can always redirect as long as an enemy is bleeding. So not only is it offensive, it's also defensive, technically speaking. Next up is the Employee card. When activating Wrath Resonance, or using a skill that gains or applies charge count, all allies gain +4 charge count at the next turn's start. Once per turn. This makes it easier to use your skill 3s early, but honestly one of the biggest problem with like overcharging is once you've used your skill 3, charge becomes completely useless most of the time. Not all the time though. A lot of their like skill 2s and things, they gain extra coin power and whatnot from having charge. but so it is good, but you know, once you're at max charge, you're at max charge, and you can't really do anything with it, you know? So this helps get to max charge quicker, but it doesn't do anything else, so... Up next is the Oscillating Bracelet. When hitting an enemy with a skill, inflict 2 Tremor potency next turn. If the skill's affinity was Wrath, inflict 4 Tremor potency instead. This guy is basically a better version of the Green Spirit. Essentially, it, you know, serves the same purpose, making it so that it's more likely that you'll have a high Tremor application by the time you actually Tremor Burst, and you'll likely get value from said Tremor Burst before actually staggering the enemy naturally, so it's very good in that sense. Next, we have the Glimpse of Flame. Turn end, consume half of burn count on enemies with burn to deal burn potency times consumed burn count times 2 bonus wrath damage. Targets lose burn count consumed by Glimpse of Flames divided by 2 defense levels for the next turn. This is, without a doubt, the best burn ego gift in the game by a mile. It basically, by itself, is the burn equivalent of Sinking Deluge. And also with Dare Frey shoots Otis, it's also technically Dark Flame in an ego gift, but straight up it just gives a payoff to having burn, and that is very good. You never want to say no to this if you have a burn team, ever. Next we have the Cigarette Holder. Turn start, allies with Poise gain 1 power-up, or 2 power-up if they're at 5. This is just free power-up to Poise IDs. It's very good to help win clashes, but not entirely necessary. It's nice to have, but you don't need it, you know? Take it if it's there and you have a ton of Poise already, but otherwise probably prioritize other stuff first. Next is the Barbed Snare. Turn end, inflict Rupture potency on all enemies equal to their current speed values plus 2. When activating Lust Absolute Resonance, apply 5 Rupture potency and plus 4 Rupture count to a random enemy at combat start. This guy is a better version of the Crown of Roses simply because it happens every single turn instead of just combat start. The Rupture count application is also pretty inconsistent, applying to only 1 random enemy, so you can get value out of the count application, but it's first off it's on Lust Absolute Resonance, and secondly, if there's multiple parts or enemies, there's no guarantee you'll actually get it on the one you want, so pretty inconsistent, but definitely better than the Crown of Roses. Next we have the Rusted Cutting Knife. When inflicting bleed potency with skill effects, inflict 3 bleed potency and plus 1 bleed count. If the skill's affinity was Lust, inflict 3 bleed potency and 2 bleed count instead. This is really good. It is pretty equivalent to the Wound Clerid in terms of actual power, but instead of it focusing mostly on potency, it does a lot better with count. I'd still say that the Clerid is probably better than it though, but they're roughly equivalent. Next is the Thorny Path. When hitting and dealing HP damage to an enemy with a skill that inflicts sinking potency, inflict 4 sinking potency and 3 sinking count at turn end, once per enemy per turn. When activating Lust Resonance, inflict 3 sinking potency and 3 sinking count to all enemies at combat start. This is an okay gift. It's sinking count for any status is pretty good. It's honestly better than just regular potency most of the time, as most identities can typically fuel the potency by themselves, but they can struggle a little bit with the count. So count is always more preferable. Even if it only is once every turn for 3 count, it still makes it pretty good. But since it is only once every turn, it's definitely makes it lose a bit of value that way. Next, we have the Red Stain Gossypium. First turn start of a wave, inflict 4 bleed potency and 20 bleed count to all enemies. Turn start, enemies with bleed lose bleed potency divided by 2 offense level and defense level for the next turn. Maxes out at 30 bleed potency stack. So this guy right here gives you 20 free bleed count, making it so you basically can never lose your stack of bleed, no matter how hard you try. And once you get a bleed stack going, the enemy will have a permanent minus 15 offense level, which is equivalent to minus 5 clash power, which is absolutely insane and really, really good. Definitely something you never want to not have in a bleed team. Up next, we have the Stone Tomb. Allies gain 2 times Poise potency from skill effects. When an ally defeats an enemy, they gain 4 Poise potency and 2 Poise count at the next turn start, once per turn. This is a very easy way to reach max Poise potency very quickly. The only issue with that is most Poise identities can already do that by themselves pretty easily. And what they really want is Poise count, which this only provides if they actually defeat an enemy. And not to mention, it only works once, so only one ally can actually gain any Poise count from this at any given time. It definitely helps reaching max Poise, but other than that, it's kind of pointless. Next, we have the Portable Battery Socket. Turn start, 3 random allies gain 3 charge count. Prioritizes identities with charge. When activating Sloth Resonance, 1 random ally gains 5 charge count at combat start. This is a worse version of the employee card. Employee card gives 4 charge at the start of every turn, basically. And this gives 3 charge to 3 allies. Okay. Not that good. Moving on. Next we have Dust to Dust. First turn start of a wave, inflict 8 burn potency and 3 burn count to all enemies. When activating Sloth Resonance, inflict 4 burn potency and 3 burn count to all enemies. Basically, the only thing going for this is it has burn count, so it's pretty... it helps maintain a burn stack. Burn depletes pretty slowly, so if you have burn count, even the smallest amount makes it much better to actually keep the burn going. It's also required for the fusion gift, which definitely gives it some value, but not really enough to bump it up any higher than that. Next up, we have the Melted Spring. Turn start, enemies with sinking lose 3 offense level and defense level for the turn. This is okay. You get an extra clash power and basically 1 fragile if an enemy has sinking. Not bad, but again, you you need syncing for it to actually do anything. So, up next, we have Downpour. Turn start, inflict current turn count times 2 Tremor potency and 2 Tremor count on all enemies. Turn end, trigger a Tremor burst on all enemies. This is an interesting one. It does constantly keep inflicting Tremor potency over and over again. And it also continuously Tremor bursts, which is pretty nice. I'd say the main issue with it is, since the Tremor burst is turn end, that means it happens last after everything else. So if you have another ego gift like Melted Eyeball, for example, that gives some sort of benefit to Tremor bursting, you will never actually get the value out of that because it happens after everyone has already used their skills, and then the turn rolls over and the effects are gone the next turn. It's okay. It's not bad, but I definitely wouldn't say it's good either. It's okay. It's fine. It serves its purpose fine. Next up, we have the 4-leaf Clover. When an ally with Poise at combat start critical hits an enemy, gain 5 Poise potency and 2 Poise count at the next turn start, once per turn. If the skill's affinity was Gluttony, gain 7 Poise potency and 3 Poise count instead at the next turn start. This guy is pretty easy Poise count maintainer, though it doesn't really give enough to make that much of a difference. It's nice to have, and it is a requirement to get the fusible gift as well, so that definitely makes it more valuable. Next, we have the Night Vision Goggles. This gift activates when an ally has 15 plus charge count at turn start. Combat start, the ally with 15 plus charge count loses 3 charge count and gains 5 offense level for the turn. This guy is honestly really good, I'd say. It gives extra... It doesn't really give that much benefit, to be honest. Like, 5 offense level isn't anything crazy, but what it does do is it actually gives some sort of value to having charge when you have nothing to spend it on. If you're at 15 plus charge count, right, then the only thing you can do is use your skill 3s to actually spend it on. Otherwise, it's just sitting up there and giving you extra coin power, basically. This guy usually doesn't really, get rid of enough charge to remove the coin power. So you're always going to have your benefits of charge, and then you're also going to have the 5 offense level on top of that. The only real problem it has is if you have multiple skill slots, you won't be able to use multiple skill 3s back to back because it will take away some of your charge, and then you won't have enough to actually be able to spend on 2 skill 3s. You'll have enough for 1, but never 2. Next, we have the Disc Fragment. Turn start, gain +1 ego resource of a random affinity for each non-gluttony ego skill used last turn. If a gluttony affinity ego skill was used, gain 3 ego resources of a random affinity for each gluttony ego skill used last turn. This is basically the same concept as Coffee and Cranes, but it's for gluttony instead of lust. It's obviously not as good as Coffee and Cranes because it doesn't give you every sin type. It gives you 3 random ones. but it still basically serves the same purpose. So if you do have gluttony skills, it's definitely something you want to have on your team. Next we have the Midwinter Nightmare. When hitting and dealing HP damage to an enemy with a skill, inflict 3 sinking potency. If the skill's affinity was gluttony, inflict 5 sinking potency instead. This guy is very, very easy sinking potency generator. If you have sinking on your team, it's good, and if you don't, it's still kind of good. Up next, we have Thrill. Turn start, inflict 6 Rupture potency and 3 Rupture count on all enemies. Turn end, inflict Rupture potency times Rupture count gluttony damage to all enemies with 3+ Rupture count. Put simply, this thing is stupid OP. It can single-handedly win games by itself. In fact, there are a few videos you can find of somebody doing exactly that. So, yeah. Probably one of the best ego gifts in the game. Next, we have the Skeletal Crumbs. Deal 12.5% damage and take minus 12.5% damage against enemies that had sinking at combat start. Allies with Gloom Affinity attack skills deal 20% and take 20% less damage instead. This has good benefits for sinking. It's basically the sinking equivalent of the Will Be Naughty Plushie. Next is the Curriculum Vitae. Turn end, allies with 7+ charge count gain 3 haste next turn. If the ally has Gloom Affinity skills, gain 4 haste and 1 power up next turn instead. So this guy is same concept as the night vision goggles, but instead of it, eating your charge, it just straight up gives you free benefits for having it. And since most charge IDs actually have Gloom skills, it means that they're going to pretty much always have an extra power, which is really, really good. Next is the Pendant of Nostalgia. Combat start, 2 random allies gain 4 Poise potency. Prioritizes identities with attack skills that gain Poise, and allies with Gloom Affinity attack skills gain 4 Poise potency and 2 Poise count instead. This guy has the same problem that the Stone Tomb has, which is Poise potency itself doesn't really matter. It's Poise count that you want, and not potency, and it only inflicts Poise count on allies with Gloom skills, so not a whole lot of them actually do have Gloom skills. Pirate Gregor, for one, does, off the top of my head, but I can't think of any else. So it's useful on him, but not much. A simple extra 2 Poise count isn't really that impactful anyways. Next we have the Broken Revolver. Turn start, enemies with Rupture have their offense level reduced by 3 for the turn. This is the same thing as the Melted Spring, but significantly worse because it doesn't have defense down. Just having offense level and no defense down makes it significantly less valuable. Up next is Artistic Sense. Deal plus 50% damage against enemies without Sanity or ones with 0 or less SP. When Sinking's effect applies to enemies without Sanity, the affinity of the damage inflicted changes to whatever is the most effective. This is insanely good on Sinking teams, basically making it so that you're always going to be doing max damage no matter what. And even if it's not on Sinking teams, it's still really, really good. Because just having a permanent 50% damage is absolutely worth it every time, without a doubt. Next, we have the Nebulizer. First turn start of a wave, all allies gain 5 Poise potency and 5 Poise count. When activating Pride Resonance, all allies gain 3 Poise potency and 3 Poise count at combat start. This is, without a doubt, probably one of the best Poise gifts, because, put simply, it straight up enables all of the specific Poise boosts on every identity's skills turn 1. And also, not to mention, most Poise identities do have Pride skills, so activating Pride Resonance is pretty dang easy, so it's basically just free Poise count whenever you feel like it, which is really good. Next, we have the Special Contract. Enemies staggered by taking skill damage also receive fixed damage by 33% of their max HP and are inflicted with 2 fragile next turn, once per encounter. This thing absolutely just straight up destroys enemies' HP once they're staggered. Basically, what it says is, once you've staggered this enemy, they will die the next turn, guaranteed. There is very, very little exceptions to this rule. Pretty much the only ones off the top of my head are probably like Shock Centipede, because he just doesn't die. Next we have Grand Welcome. Encounter start, gain +5 Pride Ego resources, and whenever an enemy dies, gain 2 Pride Ego resources, and 1 Ego resource for 2 other random affinities. This is really good if you want exclusively Pride generation, but otherwise it's not very good. It is okay, but not the greatest. Next up we have the Wrist Guards. Turn start, allies with charge count gain 2 damage up. If the ally has Pride affinity attack skills, gain 3 instead. This guy's pretty dang good for charge teams. Probably one of the best. Basically it's a free 20% damage for charge identities. 3 if you're W Ryoshu. It's pretty good. Nothing to really complain about. Next we have Clear Mirror Calm Water. Increases the ally's critical hit damage multiplier from 1.2 to 2.5. If a critical hit consumed Poise count, the ally gains 15 offense level up next turn. Activates once per identity per turn. This basically makes it so that even if you crit without special conditions on your skill, it still benefits like insanely. So technically you could use this on teams without Poise and get benefit from it, but you would need to have another Poise gift like Nebulizer to actually be able to get value out of it. So it can be an insta-pick depending on if your other ego gifts allow you to actually benefit from it. Next we have the Charred Disc. When an enemy with burn is defeated, inflict half of the burn potency on the defeated enemy to an enemy with the least burn potency at the next turn start. Turn start, inflict 4 offense level down to enemies with burn for the turn. This is nice to have. It makes it so your burn stack never really goes away, but at the same time, defeating enemies' effects aren't that good. At least it does have the offense level down, which is definitely something that's nice. Not really amazing, but definitely has its value. Next, we have the Lightning Rod. Encounter start, all allies gain 5 charge count. If 2 or more participating allies have Envy affinity attack skills, all allies gain 7 charge count instead. This guy basically functions the same as the Nebulizer, in that it enables charge teams to really just gain all their benefits turn 1 instead of having to, you know, wait and use their skills. Definitely the best charge gaining ego gift. Next is the Endorphin Kit. When gaining Poise potency from skill effects, gain 3 Poise potency and 3 Poise count. If the skill's affinity was Envy, the ally gains 4 Poise potency and 4 Poise count instead. This is Infinite Poise Generator. Enough said. Next, we have the Headless Portrait. Combat start, inflict 4 sinking potency and 1 sinking count on all enemies, with less than 0 SP. For each Envy affinity skill used, randomly inflict 3 sinking potency between all enemies next turn. This thing is not that good. It basically only works the first turn, and its second effect is pretty underwhelming. 3 sinking potency is not very good. Next, we have the Charge type gloves. Max charge count plus 10. Encounter start, all allies gain plus 8 charge count. This is basically a better version of the Lightning Rod. And also, it very much enables you to have a pretty big buffer of charge, so it's pretty good. Next up is the First Aid Kit. Turn start, one ally under 50% HP heals 25% of max HP once per encounter. Does not activate if the ally is dead. This is just solid healing when you need it the most. It is pretty dang good. Up next is the Painkillers. Turn start, staggered allies heal 12.5% of max HP and gain 3 protection for this turn. This guy, he basically just completely negates the effects of staggered, and that's its entire purpose. Very useful, don't get me wrong, but also pretty situational. Next, we have the Voracious Hammer. After winning a combat encounter, gain 3 costs for each enemy defeated. This is very good for being able to afford pretty much everything, but you do need to take it early to actually get any real value from it. The only reason these next 2 ego gifts are going to be going in Instapick specific is exclusively because it's not necessarily because of the ego gift itself, more so instead when you get them. Because if you get the Voracious Hammer and the Golden Urn, who I'm also going to put up here, if you get them on floor 5, you're not going to get any real value out of them. You can sell them, but that's basically it. But if you get them floor 1 or floor 2, they are insanely good because you can afford literally everything with them. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the Mileposts of Survival. When moving to the next floor, all identities heal by 10% of max HP and gain 100 cost. This thing can activate only a maximum of 4 times every run. More often than not, it will only activate a maximum of 3 times because you're generally not going to be able to get it floor 1, which makes it pretty bad with its effects. Like 30% healing for every identity and 300 cost. That's not very good. Up next, we have Faith. After using a plus coin skill, fully heal the ally's SP at the next turn start, unless corroded. This thing is really, really good. It basically enables you to just constantly ego spam the entire rest of the dungeon. As long as you have ego resources to spend, you can always use your ego and never have to worry about corroding ever. So, yeah, it basically gets rid of the single only downside to using Ego. Next, we have the Piece of Relationship. Upon acquisition, all deployed identities gain 10 levels. Cannot sell. This guy is also very, very good. 10 levels is basically the equivalent of 30% extra damage and damage reduction, as well as +3 clash power, which is just really, really good, especially when every single enemy is basically out-leveling you by like 20 levels. It essentially cuts that in half and makes it way more manageable. It's very good. Next is the Lunar Memory. All type and affinity resistances of enemies change to Fatal. This guy is stupid powerful. It's on par with Thrill with how powerful it is. I'd say Thrill is probably still more powerful, but Lunar Memory is a close second. Essentially making it so every single one of your attacks is 4 times effective. It is absurdly good. Next on the list is this weird Ishmael plushie thing that I have no idea what it is, but it is definitely the best of the best, and without a doubt. Alright, next up we have the Ancient Effigy. Turn start, select one of the fastest allies and apply 5 haste to them next turn. Next turn start, select one of the other fastest allies without the Ancient Effigy effect and reapply the gift effect to them. Effect expires if no other allies can be selected. Basically, this allows you to always have at least one sinner that can redirect clashes. It's not necessarily something that will help 100% of the time, but it's also something that you wouldn't really mind having either. Always having somebody who can redirect is something that's very valuable, especially in fights where the enemy is actually really fast. It's definitely something that you'd be happy to have. Next up, we have the Non-Disclosure Agreement. Turn start, a random ally deals 10% damage, effective until Non-Disclosure Agreement effect expires. The ally deals additional 10% damage every time it hits with a skill and deals HP damage to an enemy, max plus 40% damage. If the ally takes HP damage, the gift's effect expires. At the next turn start, apply the same gift effect to another random ally. Effect expires if no other allies can be selected. This just simply gives bonus damage for not taking any hits. Up to 50% extra damage, I think. Of course, it is only for a single ally, basically. Yeah. It's basically only for a single ally deals extra damage, so it's kind of equivalent to Bloody Gadget in that regard. Like, it's nice. It also costs quite a bit, so you can sell it for quite a pretty penny, which definitely gives it a bit more value, but yeah, not really that impactful. Next up, we have the Reverberation. Turn end, inflict 2 bind to enemies or abnormalities that have 10 plus tremor potency. If the target has 20 plus tremor potency, apply 2 bind and 1 paralyze instead. This is, again, just like with the Melted Eyeball. It is very good for Tremor teams because it gives benefit for Tremor when it, again, the enemy can no longer be staggered, which is basically what you want. Next up, we've got Burning Intellect. After defeating an enemy with a burn effect, 3 allies with skills that inflict burn potency gains 2 damage up at the next turn start. This is, again, just like all 3 of these guys. Any defeat enemy conditional is pretty bad and not worth it whatsoever. Next, we have the Rusted Muzzle. Whenever an ally deals 1 HP damage to an enemy with a skill, inflict 3 bleed potency on target. When using a slash skill, inflict 5 bleed potency and +1 bleed count instead. This is quite literally a one-to-one translation of the Talisman Bundle, but for bleed instead of Rupture. And honestly speaking, it's a lot less valuable because it's bleed. You've already got things like Wound Clerid and the Rusted Cutting Knife to inflict a ton of bleed potency and bleed count. So having it like this guy is just not really that good, and having bleed on characters that don't inflict bleed is, again, way less valuable than having Rupture on teams that don't have Rupture. Up next is the Bell of Truth. Inflict 2 fragile this turn and next turn to enemies affected by Tremor Burst. Activates once per attack skill that triggers Tremor Burst. This is, without a doubt, the best of the best when it comes to the Tremor. 2 fragile for 2 turns, basically, is absolutely crazy. And it can go up even more if you have multiple Tremor Bursts going on. If you have this thing upgraded, and only upgraded, mind you, because the base doesn't do it next turn, but if you do have it upgraded, and you get this plus Downpour, Downpour becomes a lot more valuable, because it would actually give Fragile next turn. So, if you have this plus Downpour, Downpour becomes a lot more valuable. Up next is the Fluorescent Lamp. Turn end, if there are enemies or abnormality parts with Rupture, apply 1 damage up and 1 haste to a random ally next turn. Repeat for number of enemies or abno parts with Rupture +3 times. So this can affect a minimum of 4 thinners, which is most of your team. If it was any less, it would definitely be less valuable, but 4 is a pretty sizable number. That's at least like 60% of your team, I think. So this is definitely very valuable when it comes to Rupture teams. Not in the same vein. I mean, the damage up and haste isn't actually that impactful when it comes to Rupture teams, because most of the damage is coming from the Rupture status effect itself. So it's nice to have, you know, but you wouldn't miss it if you never saw it. Next up, we have the Broken Compass. First turn start of a wave, randomly inflict 10 plus number of enemies times 4 thinking count between all enemies. This gives a minimum of 14 sinking count, which is very good. Count is one of the best things you can have for literally any status effect. So just straight up having that much at the very beginning is very nice. Of course, you're going to eat through it really quickly, but with how much there is, it's not really that big of an issue, especially if you are inflicting more. Next, we have the Ornamental Horseshoe. Turn start, apply 3 Poise potency to 2 random allies without Poise potency. When all allies have Poise, apply 3 Poise count to all allies instead. This is really, really good. Well, not really good. It's good if you have something like Nebulizer. Even if you don't, pretty much all of your sinners will have Poise by the time the turn ends. At which point, it will just straight up give you free 3 Poise count, which not only counteracts the negative Poise decay that happens naturally every turn, it also helps to alleviate the actual decay of Poise count from just critting. So it's really good for sustain, and that's basically it. But sustain is basically all you need for Poise teams. Next up, we have the Material Interference Force Field. First turn start of a wave, all allies gain 7 charge barrier. This is okay. It's pretty much equivalent to the lightning rod. It does basically the same thing. 7 charge barrier is basically 7 charge, just at the end of the turn instead of the beginning. So it is less valuable than lightning rod because it's not actually charge at the start, but it is charge at the end of the turn. So it's not bad. And now all we have left are the use ego gifts. Starting us off, we have Soothe the Dead, the Burn ego gift. All of these activate when 5 or more identities have attack skills that apply the specific effects that they have, this one being Burn. First turn start of a wave, inflict 3 burn count to all enemies. Randomly inflict a total of 15 burn potency between all enemies. 2 skills that inflict burn potency: Final Power +1, Coin Power +1, Inflicted Burn Potency +1, Inflicted Burn Count +1. Without a doubt, this is absolutely insane. It just straight up makes every single skill that inflicts burn absolutely crazy powerful. Extra coin power, extra final power. Most of the time that's going to be like +4 extra clash power. So that's really good. And then extra burn potency and burn count is... you're going to have a field day with this thing. Up next, we have the Bloody Mist. Allies inflict double the amount of bleed potency and bleed count. Skills that inflict bleed potency: coin power +2, and damage dealt +100%. So the thing with this is the double the amount of bleed potency and bleed count is basically what Smoke and Wires already does, which is one of the requirements to fuse it. That effect is kind of redundant because you don't need the fusion gift to actually do it, because Smoke and Wires already does it, and you have to have Smoke and Wires to get this thing. So the only reason to fuse it is for the coin power +2 and +100% damage dealt, which is still really good. 100% bonus damage on pretty much all of your skills. Absolutely crazy. Next, we have the Coupled Oscillation. Apply 5 Tremor potency and 1 fragile this turn and next turn to enemies affected by Tremor Burst. After triggering 3 Tremor Burst to a target, stagger the target at the next turn start, once per encounter. That effect is also insanely good. Simply put, having just basically a guaranteed free stagger, you can very easily set that up in such a way where you just completely decimate the enemy on the turn that it staggers. Next, we have the Enrapturing Trance. When hitting an enemy with a skill, inflict 5 Rupture potency. When Rupture count on an enemy drops below 1, consume 10 Rupture potency instead of Rupture count. This effect ends when Rupture potency drops below 0. Now this one is a bit of an interesting one. And personally, I do not think it is that good. Simply put, the only thing it really does is make it so that your Rupture stack can never truly die. But if you're either actually playing around it properly and, you know, making sure that you're not consuming too much of the Rupture count, or if you just simply have something like the Thunderbranch Ego Gift, it is basically impossible for the Rupture stack to die at all in the first place, and basically makes this Ego Gift entirely redundant. Of course, it is nice for just being able to, you know, turn your brain off when you're using a Rupture team, but it's basically completely unnecessary and doesn't really provide you any real benefit. Next, we have the Black Sheep Music. When hitting an enemy with a skill, inflict 5 sinking potency. Turn start, all enemies regain sinking count equal to sinking count consumed from getting hit last turn, divided by 2. This thing's entire purpose is to basically allow you to maintain your sinking count before you actually use Sinking Deluge, so you get a much bigger nuke when it actually happens. The potency getting reset after the nuke doesn't really matter because the potency won't get reset with it, so it'll just be a whole bunch of sinking that only does like 1 damage, so it's good before Sinking Deluge, but most of the time you're going to be just killing the enemy with Sinking Deluge anyways. So yeah, it's pretty good. Next up, we have the Lucky Pouch. Combat start. If a random ally with Poise critical hits on an enemy with a skill, all allies gain 7 Poise potency and 7 Poise count at the next turn start, once per turn. Skill 3 of identities with skills that gain Poise potency. Final power plus 3, coin power plus 12 divided by number of coins, damage dealt plus 50% divided by number of coins percent. This makes it so as long as all of your identities have Poise, you're going to always be able to maintain your Poise no matter what. And their skill 3s become absolute monsters. They become quite literally the best skill 3s in the entire game. So yeah, that's pretty dang good, if I do say so myself. And finally, the very last Ego Gift. The T1 Perpetual Motion Machine. First turn start of a wave, all allies gain 5 charge barrier and 2 damage up. Next turn start, each identity gains total charge count consumed by skill use divided by 4 offense level. Maxes out when 40 charge counts are consumed. So, for this thing, you gain 20 damage up and 5 charge barrier at the first turn, which, just like Illusory Hunt, is not very good. Having it just for a single turn is not good. If it was the entire fight, it would be good, but it's not. And the offense level, the max you can get is 10 offense level. Which 10 offense level is pretty good, don't get me wrong. That's plus 3 bonus clash power. But unfortunately, it's very unlikely that you'll actually get that much offense level. I am under the impression that the total charge count consumed is taking into account every single sinner in the fight and not just the single individual one. Because if it is just the single individual one, then it's pretty much always going to be 10 divided by 4, which is absolutely terrible because it's only like 2 offense level. But if it is every single identity, the only skills that actually spend charge are the skill 3s. So realistically, you're never going to be using more than, say, around 2 of them each turn, which is about equivalent to 20 charge spent. So that would be 20 divided by 4, which is about 5 offense level, which is pretty pathetic. And it's just, it's not good. Straight up, it's not good. That amount of offense level is not good, and it's just straight up bad. And yep, that about does it. The full, complete Ego Gift tier list by yours truly. I think it is pretty accurate. Much more so than the 1.0 version. So, yeah, that's basically it. Hope you enjoyed, and hope it's actually pretty accurate. I will see you guys in another video. Goodbye.